Namaskar, good afternoon. My name is Purnima. Welcome to Parley with Purnima. We have special guest today, Robert Spencer. Let me introduce you. Robert Spencer is the director of Jihad Watch and Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He is the author of 27 books at this moment, including New York bestsellers, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam, The Truth About Muhammad, the bestsellers, The History of Jihad from Muhammad to ISIS, The Critical Quran, and so on. And he led seminars on Islam and jihad for the FBI and the United States Central Command, United States Army Command, General Staff College, a Joint Terrorism Task Force, and Justice Department's Anti-Terrorism Advisory Council. Welcome, Robert. It's a pleasure to connect with you. You are an ocean of knowledge. You know a lot more about many of us, because me coming from India, we had no idea about all this. Now that we are getting targeted as a Hindu, Indian American here, my interest is to understand exactly where is this stemming from, and no better person to learn about Islam and jihad from you. Thank you so much for taking the time talking to us.
Oh, thank you.
Can we start from this particular note? You have taught in FBI and Joint Terrorism Task Force, counterterrorism effort and so. What has changed since Obama, or Hussein Obama, I should say? How did trainings of jihad and Islam changed in America?
That's a very important question, actually, because it has many implications far beyond even the particular issue at hand. I actually was a trainer for the FBI and the military for about 5 years, mostly during the George W. Bush administration. Then when Obama became president, I continued, but it became more infrequent. And finally, in October 2011, 57 Muslim organizations led by Muslim Advocates, which is an attorneys group, and the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is a group that's tied to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, and many South Asian organizations, groups of Muslims from India, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, and so on. They wrote to John Brennan, who was at that time in the Department of Homeland Security and then moved over to become the head of the CIA later. And they demanded that I be removed as a trainer and mentioned me by name, and that all mention of Islam and jihad be removed from counterterror training. And Brennan immediately wrote back, and he wrote back actually on stationery that was Barack Obama's stationery that said the President of the United States. Now, John Brennan had his own stationery. The point is, he wanted to communicate that this was coming from the very highest level, and that he was not acting on his own authority, but on that of the President. And he said, yes, we will remove this trainer. We will remove all mention of Islam and jihad from counterterror training. And that was the beginning in 2011 of the Countering Violent Extremism, CVE program. And the CVE, Countering Violent Extremism program, never mentioned Islam or jihad in connection with terrorism. It envisioned terrorists in a very amorphous fashion without defining who they were. And we now are seeing the insidious other side of that, that extremist is a general word. You can attach it to anyone. And so the Biden government is now using it against people who are completely law-abiding citizens and aren't remotely terrorists, but they disagree with the government's line. And so now we see that the violent extremists in question are really anybody who the regime dislikes, classified as one, even though I'm not remotely violent, have never approved of violence or applauded any violence, called for any violence, never done any of that. But I'm actually classified by the Global Internet Forum on Counterterrorism, which is the social media counterterror arm, as a violent extremist. And that shows how absurd this classification is, but also how it can be weaponized against people who oppose the regime and the establishment line.
So it has been diluted, but certainly. And I also had questions about how the counterterrorism actually became a more appeaser of terrorism. I don't understand that. But in here, you talked about John Brennan. I believe he has converted to Islam, and he even went to Mecca. No non-Muslim can even visit Mecca. So how did he visit if he was not a converted Muslim? And as a CIA stationary head, if he has not converted to Islam, and suddenly he is actually taking measures to dilute the jihad and Islamic terrorism aspect of it, don't you find some issues around this?
Oh, certainly, yeah. John Brennan almost certainly has converted to Islam. I have it on good authority from people, actually, the FBI agents who used to have me speak in the days before I was banned. They told me that it was an open secret in the FBI and the other intelligence agencies that Brennan had converted. And it's confirmed by the fact that he has spoken about jihad in a manner that is very closely reminiscent of the way that Islamic apologists speak about jihad, and downplaying its violent aspects, supremacist aspects regarding conquest and subjugation of unbelievers, and insisting that it's all just a peaceful spiritual struggle. This is the way that Islamic apologists tend to try to foster complacency among non-Muslims. And so Brennan doing that was a big red flag that he has indeed converted. As far as your first question goes, in regard to appeasement, the counterterror program in the United States was to a tremendous degree, from the beginning, oriented toward appeasement, because the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a global organization dedicated to imposing Islamic law wherever it can around the world, has infiltrated into the United States government in a very sophisticated and comprehensive manner, and has worked to convince high-level officials that Muslims feel victimized, that they are victimized to a tremendous degree, that they have legitimate grievances, and that that's why they are lashing out in terror attacks. And so the best way to diffuse terrorism is to reach out in kindness to Muslims and show that you are of goodwill. Now, it's still official American government policy, although that's never been explicitly enunciated. It's the clear assumption behind a great deal of what the US government did after 9/11. You have, for example, the fact that the US Army went into Afghanistan, toppled the Taliban very quickly, and then spent another 20 years there trying to rebuild the country, building schools, building hospitals, highways, and so on, with the idea being, the unspoken assumption being, that the Afghans would see that Americans were not evil and were not their enemies, and they would be grateful for what had been done for them, and an ally of the United States would be created. This was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Islam, or a refusal even to study Islam and to try to understand Afghanistan through that prism at all, even though Afghanistan is still thoroughly Islamic. The Islamic religion, in the Quran, it teaches that the Jews and Christians will never be satisfied with you unless you leave Islam. Now, that is the word of Allah. That's the perfect word of the sole perfect God, and consequently, a Muslim reads that, and then he sees the Americans there building schools and highways and hospitals, and he thinks, oh, they're just trying to get me to leave Islam. He hates them more than he loves them, you see? And so the whole thing, the strategy was appeasement that was designed to win hearts and minds, but it only antagonized them even more.
So it never worked out in the past. Appeasement never worked out in the past with Islamists.
Never worked with Islam. In the history of the world, since Islam has been in existence, there has never been a group that successfully appeased and accommodated it and brought about peaceful coexistence. That's never happened. There's just been conquest and subjugation.
Tell us why. Is that something to do with their ideology of establishing Islam throughout the world, submitting the entire world under the feet of Allah? Is that why the cause?
Yes. The Quran is very clear, and Muhammad is very clear in the Hadith, that it is part of the responsibility of the Muslim community to wage jihad against non-Muslims in order to bring them under the hegemony of Islam. Now, the people of the book, so-called, the Jews and Christians primarily, as well as Zoroastrians, in the Quran are given a status where they can submit to the overlordship, the hegemony of the Muslims, and remain in their religions and be tolerated as long as they remain submissive. But the Hindus were not people of the book and consequently had to either convert to Islam or be killed. Now, in practice, during the conquest of India, beginning in the 7th century, there were so many Hindus it was impractical to kill them all and impossible to convert them all, and consequently they were accorded a kind of honorary people of the book status. But this was always contingent and never respected as much as it was in regard to the Jews and Christians, because it's not in the Quran, and consequently the Hindus had it much worse, and the jihad against India was much more violent than the jihad against Europe.
When you were talking about specifically Hindus, we are not part of the people of the good book, and they obviously came and started attacking the Hindu Indian territory in 711 AD. And today what we see after almost 1300 plus years, what we see is that Islamic narrative of war against Hindus are winning constantly. And I don't see American politicians specifically understand or even take the time to understand our point of view that, yes, we were the oppressed one, but they are constantly pushing that we Hindus are casteist, we Hindus are broadcast over here, we Hindus are, we're not contributing anything to the country of America. So these are some of the narratives they're pushing, and they're succeeding as well. Why is that?
Because of the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood linked groups in the United States, principally the Council on American Islamic Relations, as well as the Islamic Society of North America, the Muslim American Society, and others. They are, of course, deeply against Hindus and are spreading the ideas that you were talking about here in the United States, that the Hindus are bringing caste and casteism into the United States, that they are Hindutva radicals who are intent on making war against non-Hindus, and which is a classic case of projection, accusing your enemy of that which you're guilty of. But they have all this power and influence because, in the first place, they have millions of dollars. The Saudis have spent millions of dollars on groups such as these, as well as at American universities and elsewhere, and that money has bought influence. And so the Islamic perspective is taken for granted to a tremendous degree in the United States, in the policy think tanks in Washington, in the universities that send people into those policy think tanks, in the media, and so on. And groups such as the Council on American Islamic Relations spread all this nonsense and these falsehoods about Hindus. And there's not a significant pushback because the Hindu population simply doesn't have the same kind of money, power, or influence. The Muslims have been working on infiltrating and embedding themselves into American government and society for many decades now, and now they're thoroughly entrenched, and so it's paying off for them.
Quite mind-boggling to me. After 9/11, within 7 days, George Bush went over right in that center and declaring Islam as a religion of peace. And today, after 20 years, we see that Islamic population in America they're able to wage war against Hindus. We haven't gone and blew up any building. I have not seen any Indian American specifically coming to America or any country they go to go with an idea of converting that particular country into Hinduism. Or we don't even have that kind of thought in our thought process. So how are they able to do this? Are they actually waging jihad against Hindus at this point of time when they are offensively attacking and pushing false narratives against us?
Yes, certainly this is all part of the jihad against Hindus. That remember, there's not just violent jihad, but there's also jihad of the pen, jihad of the tongue, jihad of the pocketbook. Jihad takes many forms. And so one of the principal forms that it takes is to spread propaganda that fosters the point of view that makes people more accepting of the violent jihad, or of the idea that the Muslims have to defend themselves against this vicious enemy, and so on. That this enemy is one that threatens not just the Muslims, but everyone. Now, of course, this is fanciful, as you noted, when it comes to Hindus, but most Americans don't have any idea at all, because they don't know anything about Islam and they don't know anything about Hinduism or India either. And so these Muslim groups that have placed themselves, been able to manage to attain positions of influence, tell them these Hindus are dangerous right-wing radicals who are victimizing members of other communities. They don't have any frame of reference with which to evaluate that. And so they fall for it all too often.
But Americans, in my experience, as often that I've been speaking about cause of Hindus, I've been blamed for a majority of names that you are also getting threatened on. But what I find is that Americans actually know about caste system. They actually blame Hindus of caste system, and I'm seeing it both in the right and left wing. They target Hindus on this particular issue and corner us, saying that we are castes, and they actually support the bill that is happening in California at this point of time. Do you have anything to say on that?
Well, I do believe that's here again. It's the influence of these Islamic groups. I can tell you that in public school in the 1970s, we were taught about casteism, and I expect that that's probably true all across the country. It's about the only thing that American school children are taught about Hindus and Hinduism. And so the idea that it's being spread now and that there needs to be some kind of law against it in the United States is not really all that difficult for people who are uninformed to believe, because this is about all they know about the thing in general. And consequently, it doesn't seem all that implausible.
So are you saying, Robert, I'm very concerned, are you saying the law enforcement agencies and the government, state government and the federal government, the politicians, the media, the education system has actually spread massive amount of misinformation against the Hindus for decades so far, and now they are pushing to label Hindus as the oppressor category in order to segregate and redlining them? What do we do as a Hindu legally immigrated, not crossing border illegally and burdening the welfare system? What a Hindu must do, and what a Hindu Indian American must do?
I think actually emulate the Islamic groups, which might seem to be an odd thing for me to say, but actually they're masters of communication. They have mastered the ways to reach Americans, and particularly influential and powerful Americans. And so study the history of the Council on American Islamic Relations and the Islamic Society of North America. Get their literature. Make pamphlets and other kinds of literature explaining what exactly is wrong with this idea that there needs to be a law against casteism, and why there's nothing really to worry about in regard to casteism and Hindus in the United States. And make it something that's very clear, in plain English, very easy to understand for people who have no idea about any of this.
I don't think, Robert, the politicians are willing to listen to us. Why?
Yes, people who are not willing to listen because they're bought and paid for. And so, in terms of cultivating powerful and rich friends, I wish I could help you, but that has always been beyond me. In any case, when it comes to trying to persuade and convince, however, that I know about, and I think that if you simply and clearly state your case and take it energetically to the people where these measures are being propagated and fight back, not just in terms of saying our rights are being violated or that these things are dishonest, but explaining very clearly and simply and easily what is casteism really? Does it really have any place in Hinduism? Does it really have any place in the United States? What exactly is the point of these measures, and so on, and try to show people that the real problem is not Hindus in the United States. The real problem is Islamic jihadis in the United States, for example. These things, there is a very big propaganda war being waged, and it's certainly true that it's a lot easier to get your propaganda across when you have many, many hundreds of millions of dollars behind you, and they do, because Saudi Arabia is one of the richest countries in the world, and then there's Qatar, which is also quite wealthy, and so on and so on. So they do have money to get their point of view across. But I think that it's also true that there are a lot of Americans at the local level who simply are not informed about these issues. And so you need to counter the arguments that are being made on the other side.
Our only option is to do a decade of research and come up with some literature and then go to the politicians. The politicians already have rejected us. They don't listen. The media don't listen. The academia doesn't listen. The school boards doesn't listen. Nobody, we find no allies who wants to hear our side of the story, or when they present some information to them, they come to us for verification, corroboration. They don't do that. And I have seen that happening over and over again. Anti-CA resolutions were passed by Democrat cities. They have tried to vilify Modi on the Godra riots, but what caused it, nobody talks about it. In Indian,
I'm certainly not saying wait a decade and then act, not at all. And every time this happens, you should call attention to it in every way possible and notify the local media. The local media may be indifferent, but you at least make the effort and say that this is happening, and we're not even allowed to tell our side. And this politician is bought. He's corrupt. We expect that there needs to be an investigation into where his money is coming from, because he's so clearly favoring one group of citizens over the other, and this is completely illegitimate in the American framework.
I know you know a lot more about Indian context and the jihadi activities that happened on the Hindus. So I'd like to actually dive into the Nupur Sharma. You have seen what has happened in the Nupur Sharma case. She was provoked, and the Maulana who was humiliating and shaming Hindu gods completely is living in with no harm at all, where Nupur Sharma has been taken off the grid. She has been given state security, that's what I hear, and she has been maligned, and there is eight beheading that has happened after Nupur Sharma case. Taking that and inciting violence based on some of the Islamic handles who actually incited violence to create that kind of situation and landscape in India. Tell us about your thoughts on that.
Well, of course, in the first place, in a rational sense, it's completely insane, because what Nupur Sharma said was entirely true and readily demonstrable. She said that if you were maligning Hindu gods, how would you feel if I started to speak about Muhammad marrying a 6-year-old? Now, in the classic Islamic sources that Muslims take for granted as being axiomatically true, Muhammad married a 6-year-old. So Nupur Sharma didn't make this up. She's not reading Islamophobic literature or something of this kind. It's right there in the Islamic sources. Now, of course, you will find many Islamic apologists in these days when child marriage is universally understood as being harmful to little girls. You find many Islamic apologists denying this. But nonetheless, then you can turn around and see in Afghanistan, for example, which is so fanatically Islamic, half of the girls in the 2nd grade are already married. All the girls from 3rd grade up are married. Child marriage is taken for granted, and it's because of Muhammad's example that it's considered completely justified. And so, in the first place, she spoke the truth. The whole idea is to make non-Muslims afraid to say anything except what Muslims allow them to say. So in other words, it's working toward our submission. The submission we were talking before about, the subjugation of the non-Muslim is one of the objectives of Islam. And so the Nupur Sharma episode was all in the service of trying to intimidate the non-Muslims into accepting the hegemony of Islam and making people think, I better not dare say anything about Muhammad or Islam. Otherwise, I could end up beheaded myself. And the only things I will say are what the local imam says or what the Muslim spokesman say is okay for me to say. And so then you've submitted, you see? And so the hegemony of Islam is extending over you. So that's the idea of it. The whole point of it was to intimidate us into submission.
Robert, you mentioned about subjugation and submissions and etc. I want to take it a little bit further in terms of terror. This religion is labeled as a religion of peace, but I see no peace in it. What I see is a brilliant marketing tool that literally hides every action under this label. Could you please explain to us what this label is actually mean?
Peace in the first place is an outright lie, because Islam is not a religion of peace. It's a religion of war and conquest and the subjugation of the infidel. So in that sense, it's simply an exercise of deception in accord with Muhammad's dictum, war is deceit, and his allowance of lying in wartime. There's a perpetual state of war in Islamic theology between Islam and the infidels. And so wartime is all the time. You can lie to the infidels if it benefits Islam. At the same time, however, there also is a grain of truth to it, because Islam's final outcome is peace. That is, when Islamic law is imposed over the whole world, and the infidels are all killed or converted to Islam, and everyone is submitting on pain of fear of being beheaded or stoned or having their hand amputated or whatever, then there's peace. And so that is the final goal of Islam. And in that sense, then it's a religion of peace.
So peace through swords, peace through terror, peace through submission.
Yes.
So when we talk about brotherhoods, this is only brotherhood for Islam. The non-Muslim doesn't have a place in their world. And there is already a division between us versus them. A Muslim versus other. We are already otherized community. So in this case, tell me, or actually educate me. I don't understand how the Islamic groups today is able to educate a high level of officials and organizations like IRF, USC, IRF, etc. With pluralism. They are pushing this narrative that Islam is the religion of pluralism. Please tell me, what am I missing here?
You're not missing anything. They're lying. And they're lying based on what I just explained about Muhammad saying war is deceit and so on. That's the justification for doing so. But see, they are basing their actions on the assumption that the officials that they are talking to don't know anything about Islam and are not going to learn anything about Islam except from them. And so they don't tell them that the Quran says, for example, Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Those who follow him are ruthless to unbelievers, merciful to one another. It's chapter 48, verse 29. You'll never find the Council on American Islamic Relations quoting that verse. It doesn't exist as far as they're concerned. I mean, insofar as they're pious Muslims, they know very well that it exists, and they may apply it in their own lives, and they may apply it in the policy of their organization, but they're never going to tell any officials who are non-Muslim, who they're supposedly educating, that the text says that. And they're never going to speak about the distaste, the contempt, the hatred toward unbelievers that runs all through the Quran and Islam in general, and the necessity to wage war against them. They just don't talk about these things, and these people don't know anything about Islam, so they don't know how they're being misled.
But I would have thought the educated Americans have at least employed a little bit of intellect in terms of questioning the other side of it. And instead of silencing the people who's actually bringing a different kind of views. Today, as a Hindu legal immigrant to America, what is happening to America is something that I am not able to put a finger on. Are we afraid? Are our politicians afraid? Or have we become dhimmis? What has happened to our society here?
The politicians are not dhimmis, they're bought. They get money from Qatar, from Saudi Arabia, from entities that are funded by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, from groups that tell them that if they don't say that Islam is peace and Islam is wonderful, then they'll be vilified as Islamophobic, and then they'll be voted out, that kind of thing. The politicians don't know anything. I'm sorry to say as an American, but you give Americans too much credit in saying, don't they investigate the other side? No. Most Americans don't have any interest in these issues at all. And if they might know about their own religion to some degree, but very few Americans have studied other religions. And if they have, the ordinary textbooks, when I was going through college and graduate school, I didn't learn about Islamic Jihad. We learned about Islam in a very sanitized manner. And it was only when I was reading the Quran on my own and reading the Hadith and the life of Muhammad did I start to see exactly how bloody this whole thing is. But most Americans have no idea of that, and there's been a 20-some year campaign now, since 9/11, to tell them it's all peace. And that's been, of course, that's a program that goes back to these same Islamic groups and the influence that they've wielded over the US government and the media. So most Americans don't know. Nobody's interested in telling them except people like me who are vilified, of course, in the mainstream for precisely because we do so. And so the average American has no idea of any of this.
How are you dealing with the threats, the death threats that you get? And what kind of security protection the state is providing?
Oh, the state doesn't provide any. The state, as a matter of fact, would love to see me get killed by Islamic jihadis. I say that not lightly, actually, because in 2015, I was the co-sponsor, co-organizer, and one of the speakers at a Muhammad art exhibit and cartoon contest, along with Pamela Geller in Garland, Texas, in May 2015. And Islamic State, ISIS, jihadis came to kill us all. And it came out later that there was an FBI informant who was in touch with those jihadis beforehand, but nobody in our group, in our security team, or any of us were notified that there were jihadis planning to come to the event. Nor were we told that the FBI was talking to them. And the FBI informant was encouraging them, not discouraging them, encouraging them to attack the event, and was driving behind them in the next car when they came into the parking lot. And after they came into the parking lot of the event, they took their guns out and started shooting and shot one of our security people. This happened in Texas in 2015, and we asked the FBI in Freedom of Information Act requests, what were you doing there? Why were you encouraging the jihadis? et cetera, et cetera, and got no answer, never an answer to this day. And so I don't have any trust in the US government. I don't think that they like me particularly. And I don't think they're making active efforts to do away with me, or probably they would have done so already, but I don't think that they're going to give me any help. When I speak in an area that's likely to be hostile, and I always hire people to be there with me, it's becoming increasingly dangerous in the United States because of the massive influx of the Afghan Muslim migrants, many of whom are very fanatical, none of whom were vetted, contrary to promises and so on. But you know, when nobody's guaranteed the next day anyway, you just have to keep going.
I know they tried to even poison you somewhere.
Yeah, I was actually poisoned. That was in Iceland in 2017. Guy slipped some things into my drink when I wasn't looking. And so I was very sick for a while, but thank God got better, and they haven't gotten me yet. One day they may, but I'll keep going till then.
I'm concerned because United States of America, has it become Islamic State of America? Because in that case, we do not have any way to speak our voice at all. It's just a sham at this point of time.
Well, it's certainly heading in that direction. And even now, there are political figures and local officials who have been removed from office after criticizing Islam, as if this were a Sharia state. The Council on American Islamic Relations raises some big controversy, and they resign under pressure. And that's a very negative sign, because there doesn't seem to be anybody who understands the implications or is standing up for the freedom of speech. But at the same time, the victory is not complete at this point, and it may never be.
In Islam, you have so many sects, and 72 sects, and within that sects, they have some upper caste and lower caste, and etc. Sunni, Shia, Ahmadiyas, and etc. etc. This caste bill that is being promoted and pushed in California, they have changed some language in there, and they're saying that it's all South Asian. It's going to impact just South Asian, not just Indian. Now, any discussion or any books that you earlier mentioned, that United States even taught pupils in the country that casteism is connected to Hinduism. Now, when they change this kind of language over here and they deny that it is going to target the Hindu population, both the left, of course, the left is one who's actually pushing, but the right side, Republican politicians are also going along and passing and promoting this to pass. What am I supposed to take or infer out of it? They made sure that Indians, especially Hindus, were maligned with this caste label forever and ever, especially the ones who comes here as engineers, and working in big corporations, and you heard about the Cisco case and etc. What do the Hindus should do at this point of time, when we know for a fact that this particular bill, if passed and enacted, will target the Hindus, segregate and humiliate and discriminate against the Hindus and Hindu Indian Americans?
Well, here again, I think you need clear and simple explanations of why it is so threatening and why it is so dishonest and why it's so one-sided. And you're absolutely right that there is in a certain sense casteism in Islam and elsewhere as well. The Islam is very supremacist in terms of Arab being an Arabic language, Arabic culture. Even converts to Islam suddenly become Arabs and have to take Arabic names. And so that's something also that you could emphasize and say that these things are not something that is solely the province of Hinduism, but this is found everywhere. But make no mistake, the Muslim groups will be saying, no, Islam is radically egalitarian and everyone is equal before Allah, and they'll be spreading all that. And so you have to be prepared and have an effective counter and show, on the one hand, that that's not true in their communities, and also that what they're saying about your community is also not true. Fighting the propaganda war point by point, fighting the rhetoric with the truth is all important. I can't emphasize it enough.
Um, do you know about this Islamophobia bill that Ilhan Omar was trying to push? Can you tell us what's the implication that would be on the American society?
Yeah, it looks like it's a funny thing because the bill was never passed, but it looks like it's become law anyway. Ilhan Omar wanted there to be an Islamophobia envoy in the State Department, a kind of a watchdog who would monitor supposedly incidents of Islamophobia in other countries. And then presumably the State Department would put pressure on those other countries not to be Islamophobic. Now, the problem is Islamophobia has never been adequately defined. And the word is used to refer to the targeting of innocent Muslims in vigilante attacks, which are never justified, but also to refer to ordinary analysis, honest analysis of the motives and goals of jihad terrorists. So if it's that, then we need it. But if it's these attacks on innocent people, then of course it should be outlawed. You have this big problem with definition. And so it's likely that if Ilhan Omar's bill had passed and there would be this State Department office set up, it would be pressuring other countries to stop efforts to curb terrorism, because the efforts to curb terrorism are always characterized by Islamic groups as Islamophobia. And so that's one problem with it. But the other problem is that the bill passed the House but was never considered in the Senate, which means it should have died. End of story. But Joe Biden just announced recently that he was appointing a special envoy to combat Islamophobia, which is exactly what this bill was supposed to set up. And so he's just ignoring that the bill was not passed and acting as if it was. And that is, of course, all of a piece with his disdain for the Constitution and for any kind of restraints on his power.
Well, Biden is probably trying to get some favor to save himself from the bribery allegations that came across, which was actually reported back in 2018 and the State Department ignored again. So am I hearing right what you are saying in terms of we cannot criticize Islam, we cannot talk about Islam, we cannot speak our point of view? The State Department, the Obama's administration has fired you, and the counterterrorism is an appeasement group. And now Biden is taking it further. Even if there is no law, they are pushing the watchdog in terms of making sure that counterterrorism efforts are diluted and stopped. What am I hearing here? Is that all correct?
That's all correct. And there's no doubt that although this special envoy is supposed to only deal with other countries, there's really no doubt whatsoever that the Islamophobia in the United States will also be targeted. And that means the kind of discussion we're having right here, any honest discussion of the jihad threat, any honest opposition to Sharia oppression of women, it'll all be Islamophobia and silenced accordingly.
I know you have done a tremendous amount of research, 27 books. It's fantastic in terms of the knowledge base that you have right now. You are being silenced massively. Anybody who speaks with you will be labeled as well. And I know the threat for myself as somebody who's involved in politics and speak on geopolitics. I understand the implication of it. But tell me, from your research as an American, have you ever seen Hindus coming to America, trying to terrorize America at this point of time, with all of your research, of global research that you have done? Could you please tell us, when we get to hear we are nationalist, Hindu nationalist, extremist, saffron terrorist, we hear all these labels. We know we don't have the money you spoke about. We know we don't have the ecosystem that higher type of organization provides, or the Muslim Brotherhoods provide, or Saudi or Qatar provides. We don't even have local politicians, the media support or the academia support. how do we respond? Or what would you say as an American to the broader community of American community today?
Oh, I would say, look, there have been 42,000 jihad terror attacks around the world since 9/11. There have been quite a few in the United States. There was Fort Hood, there was Boston, there was San Bernardino, Chattanooga, many other violent jihad attacks, Pensacola. I could go on and on and on. People don't know how many jihad terror attacks there have been. If you ask the average American, did you know that there was a Muslim in the mall in St. Cloud, Minnesota, who was going up to people and saying, "What is your religion?" And if they said Christian, he would stab them. And if they said Muslim, he would pass them by. People don't know this happened. And there are so many. There was a man who went into an Israeli-owned restaurant in Columbus, Ohio, and began stabbing the people who were sitting in the restaurant because they were in this Israeli-owned restaurant. This kind of thing is not publicized. And so in the first place, I would draw attention to that and then say, now you tell me how many terror attacks have been committed by Hindus around the world since 9/11, or in the United States since 9/11. And of course, the answer is zero. And so it's just absolutely absurd. And it's a massive case of deflection and projection. The Muslim groups love to do these, to carry out deflection and projection. When you start talking about Islamic jihad terrorism, then they say, well, what about this? Like, for example, I'm always talking about jihad terrorism because I have Jihad Watch that tracks jihad terrorism. And every hour there's a new post about a news story. And almost invariably, people respond on Twitter when it goes up on Twitter, and they say, what about this that happened over here? And a Christian or a Hindu or somebody did this other terrible thing. Why aren't you talking about that? Well, I'm not talking about that because I'm tracking jihad. But also, the fact is that those incidents, even if they are authentic, are far more rare than incidents of violent jihad. But people are not educated about these things, and they're thoroughly propagandized in the opposite direction, so they don't know.
Today I see an unholy alliance with the Islamists, the Muslims, the Marxists, even the missionaries, and the Mexics. Puneet Sahani says Mexics. I don't know if anybody has defined that before or not, the ones who wants Khalistan. The alignment of this scares me to the core because this is a most violent attempt of dismissing a peaceful religion like Hindus and Hinduism, who goes to different parts of the world, who has never waged any war against anybody, or non-Hindus especially. Could you please tell us exactly what is this particular alliance and why the leftist missionaries align with this Muslims and Mexics and etc.? It is particularly very scary to me.
Well, I know less about the Khalistani movement, but I can speak about the left and Islam. There you have authoritarians on both sides, and that's why they love each other, because they both hate free societies, they both hate the freedom of speech, they both want to establish a perfect society on earth, and they envision doing so by means of horrific violence. Whenever the left has taken power, going back to revolutionary France, and then the Soviet Union and China and Cambodia and everywhere else you want to name, wherever the left has taken power, it starts a reign of terror and kills its enemies, terrorizes the rest of the population into submission. Now that's submission, that's Islam. When Islam takes power, it imposes Sharia. What is Sharia but a kind of reign of terror in which those who get out of line are brutalized and subjected to violence in exactly the same kind of way. And so this is why they love each other. They're both authoritarians who want to establish a perfect society on earth by means of violence. And so they see each other as ideological brothers in a certain sense.
So have you ever seen any Islamic country which is democratic?
No, the only one is Turkey. And Turkey is a very poor example because Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, explicitly rejected political Islam. He wanted to model, he thought that Islam was the reason why the Ottoman Empire fell and that it was weak for so long. And he wanted to model Turkey after the successful states of his day, which were the European states. And so he wanted to establish a secular constitution and limit the power of Islam. And so Turkey was a rejection of Islam insofar as it was a democracy. Now, with Erdogan, Turkey is rejecting secularism and re-Islamizing and becoming more authoritarian as a result.
So are you thinking the Ottoman Empire is reviving?
Oh, Erdogan wants that very much. And so he's working toward it. He's already made it clear he considers the territory that was once occupied by the Ottoman Empire as belonging to Turkey now. And I fully expect he will start wars in the next few years if he retains power with Greece and other countries to try to regain that territory.
So what you felt when Bush went over there after 9/11 and declared Islam is a religion of peace, what you went through and what did you think was changing at that point of time?
Well, I was appalled. I was shocked that he did it. I was even more concerned with the fact that he was standing in front of Abdurrahman al-Amoudi, who is now in prison for financing al-Qaeda, and Nihad Awad, who is still the head of the Council on American Islamic Relations, which, as I noted before, is tied to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. And so it was clear that he was being told fictions and falsehoods by people who were not on the side of the United States, and he was believing it all without any hesitation. And that was a terrible thing to see. I thought at first that he was saying it for tactical reasons, but that practically he would act to limit the power of jihad groups, but that turned out not to be the case. His government ultimately implemented policies that were in line with that statement.
Social media has brought us together. We know a lot more today than before, but I see that there's a concerted effort in order to suppress that as well. There is something that is happening in Europe. I wonder if it had anything to do with the Islam aspect of it, because recently British PM Sunak has, or his administration, talked about Pakistani grooming gang. It just came along, so I don't know if there's any connection. Do you see any connection to that? The European Union, I suppose, has spoken about how they wanted to curb communications and etc. in Twitter. I just saw that news recently. I don't know if it has anything to do with the Islamophobia thing.
Oh, there's certainly, yeah. The European Union wants to restrict speech about Islam. There's no doubt about that, because they've brought massive numbers of Muslims into Germany, France, Sweden, Italy, all over the continent, and Europe will be Islamic by the end of this century. And so these people don't want to see large-scale resistance to what they're doing. That's why they want to shut down the freedom of speech. As far as any connection to Sunak and him speaking honestly about the grooming gangs, well, he didn't exactly go all the way, because the point is not really that they're Pakistani. The point is that they're Muslim. It's the justification within Islam for concubinage and sex slavery that justifies the rape gangs, but he didn't get that far. It was good that he acknowledged they were Pakistani. That was more than many of his predecessors have been willing to do, but he still didn't go far enough.
True. Thank you so much, Robert. You have given so much of time to us, but I want to summarize what our conversation was. What I hear from you is we in America, we are going towards Islam. There's a saying that you want to monitor and see who you are not allowed to speak about. They are the one who's ruling you. You cannot speak about Islam. You cannot criticize Islam. You cannot speak for your own existence and bring up what's happening to your own community. You are going to be labeled. From the FBI to CIA to Obama's administration to Bush administration to today's Biden's administration, things have slid quite rapidly. After 20 years of 9/11, we see a massive change in terms of narrative. The game of info war is won by Islamists, and they have the money, they have the fundings, they have the organizations, they know how to harass people, how to target people, how to communicate with the politicians and by the politicians. We as a Hindu, at this point of time, after speaking to Robert, it's very clear. We as a Hindu, we cannot survive here in America. We are going to be labeled, we are going to be targeted, we're going to be killed if we don't take it to the point that we actually speak to the politicians and have the media at least and hear our side of the story. The fight just started, so we are way behind on our ability to make things happen. But I think if we stay together and understand the root cause of the problem and actually able to connect to the right people and right entities, I'm sure there will be some changes. Maybe through this, there will be people like us who's going to be targeted and killed. But I guess if it comes to that, it will come to that. We have, I guess, be a bit more courageous and speak about the issues instead of bringing our own people down. And I don't know how so far Robert has dealt with this particular issue. He mentioned he takes his own security. How many people of you or I are able to bring our own private security when needed? We can't. So depending on the state, depending on our local government, is probably going to vanish very pretty soon as well. We have seen that in Europe, we have seen that in India, we are now seeing that in America. So with that, Robert, do you have any parting thoughts today?
Well, nobody has life guaranteed forever, and so we have to be willing to take risks and stand up for what's right, even if it might cost us our lives. Otherwise, our children are going to be condemned to far worse existence, and so it's worth the effort and worth the sacrifice.
Very well. Thank you so much, Robert. It was a pleasure speaking to you. Be safe and let's stay in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Bye.